Hi everyone, my name is Anastasiia Lapatina and you're watching This Week in Ukraine, a video podcast from the Kyiv Independent. Every week, I sit down with one of my newsroom colleagues to dive into Ukraine's most pressing issues. And this time, you guys can probably guess what we're talking about. It's Wagner, Russia's notorious private military company founded by Yevgeny Prigozhin, and their failed attempt to take on Russia's military establishment in Moscow. I'm joined by the Kyiv Independent reporter Francis Farrell. Francis, it's always great to have you back.
Yeah, what a week this has been. Maybe we should call this episode This Week in Russia.
Something like that, yeah. So June 24th was really, truly a crazy day. We all watched reports of columns of Wagner mercenaries just going through Russian soil, occupying cities and military sites, ultimately trying to reach Moscow as kind of a rebellious sign against Russia's current military leadership. But let's go back to the roots of all of this mess, and ultimately to the person behind it. So Wagner's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is he and what's his story?
Yeah, so the root of this mess is certainly Yevgeny Prigozhin in many ways, although in his current form he's a bit of a creation of Vladimir Putin, but we'll get to that. He is well known as a former criminal. He spent about 9 years in prison around the end of the Soviet Union for petty crime, and then he was released. And as many of these Russian businessmen do, like climbed up the business ladder, was an entrepreneur with a lot of dirty practices, famously a hot dog salesman at some point, and food seemed to be really profitable for him. To the point where he climbed up the ladder, he started to run bigger and bigger companies, and he came in very good favor with Vladimir Putin.
He's now referred to as his chef, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting to. All the stuff about Putin's chef. His company, Concord Group, was the official caterer for the Kremlin, and also got a lot of very lucrative contracts with the actual Russian military, which seems a bit ironic now. But anyway, and then through that favor, I guess, then he started getting involved with other ventures in a way that basically solves problems that the Kremlin needs solving. And one of them was this famous troll farm in St. Petersburg, which is credited with interfering with the US elections and other things. And of course, Wagner itself, the mercenary company, which has been involved in Ukraine since 2014, and of course in Syria, Africa, anywhere where a dictator needs a bit of help and comes to Moscow for that help.
So Wagner has been involved in Ukraine since 2014. Did the role change when Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022?
Yeah, it changed in a big way, of course, in the whole way that the war changed. At first, in the first 8 years of the war, Wagner was a typical kind of tool of plausible deniability for Russia to continue that fight in Donbass against Ukraine, which everyone knows they were very involved with and coordinated from the start, but have a way to do it without admitting that it's coordinated by Moscow. But then, obviously, once the full-scale invasion started, all gloves were off, but Wagner was still there. It was an experienced and quite professional fighting unit. And they got involved very quickly, but really started to fight on a larger scale around summer last year as part of this big Russian push in Donbass, which is what they've been doing ever since, basically. And in a way, they really benefited from, of course, their previous combat experience all over the world, but they've also benefited from a much more informal and kind of flexible command and organization structure. They don't have this kind of legacy, intense command structure, which is complicated, bureaucratic, corrupt, and kind of lumbering.
Yeah, holdover from Soviet times, I guess.
Yeah, so in autumn last year, we saw Prigozhin himself start to travel around Russian prisons and recruit tens of thousands of prisoners with a simple deal. Like, you fight for us for 6 months, you'll probably die, but if you don't, you'll have money and you'll have your freedom. And a lot of people in these Russian prisons took him up on that. And so that's around the time as well that the Russian assault on Bakhmut really started to escalate, not only in the city, but around the flanks. And in these areas, I mean, I was there, I saw it happening. Wagner was able to kind of use a really specialized kind of dual tactic. We talk about human waves, and I guess these prisoner soldiers were often used in these kind of human waves attacks, but they were done together with the more professional soldiers under plenty of artillery fire. And it proved to be a formula that really worked for attacking, for taking Ukrainian territory bit by bit. Just kind of by brute force, and in a time when Ukraine was on the offensive in autumn, and the regular Russian military certainly wasn't having any success whatsoever. So I guess that's when we realized that Wagner is one of the main kind of columns of Russia's war in Ukraine.
It's clear that the relationship between the Wagner group and Prigozhin and the Kremlin was a very mutually beneficial one. It was lucrative, it worked militarily. But things started going wrong. I guess my question is when and why?
So things started to go wrong, not necessarily with the Kremlin itself, but with the Russian Defense Ministry, with the regular military, with Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and with the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, who Prigozhin mentions constantly in his videos. Of course, these two entities were in competition for resources and for political favor from the Kremlin, which they both depend on. And Shoigu and Gerasimov depend on him, on Putin for their jobs. And as I said, for a while, they'd been failing in many ways. They'd been the victims of two very successful Ukrainian counteroffensives, while meanwhile, Prigozhin was showing that he can get the job done. He can attack. He can take new territory, which is what Putin desperately wanted, of course. So in February, we had this first instance of Prigozhin outwardly complaining about not having ammunition for his troops, and directly blaming the Russian Defense Ministry for kind of screwing him over, for betraying Russia in many ways with their corruption, with their bureaucracy, and claiming that Wagner troops were dying because of the lack of ammunition to support them. And I'll say on the ammunition issue, like you ask any Ukrainian soldier who's been around Bakhmut for months and months over winter and spring, they'll say they never had any problems. You could barely ever feel like this was a quiet week with ammunition or something like that. Whether it was because of ammunition or because that's how the battle was going for him, he was losing his fighters more and more. And with his fighters came, he was losing his chance at political success. He was losing his chance to get more favor from the Kremlin, get more resources to go further, because at this point, and that's what happened in the end, that he took Bakhmut, but that's all. At that point, he'd run out of steam, and Wagner had run out of fighters to really keep going and be effective. So, as he's smart, obviously, he saw the writing on the wall, and that's when these public kind of complaints about the ministry, about Shoigu, got really intense around the beginning of May. He was standing in front of his own dead fighters, really grim, just like yelling at the camera, saying like, "Where are the effing ammunition?"
He was also asking, I think, I wonder where is Shoigu's son? What is he doing? Is he fighting in this war that these kids are dying for? And it was really brazen attacks.
Yeah, and that brings a good point about Prigozhin's self-image. Obviously, he has always traveled very close to the front line, unlike basically anyone else in the Russian command. There's no smoke and mirrors here. He was in Bakhmut while the city was still contested. He built up this image very successfully of a man who gets the job done, who speaks the truth, unlike the ideological propaganda, bureaucratic kind of Russian machine of which Shoigu and other elites whose children study abroad and they've got all their villas and their yachts and so on, like a real kind of people's man, people's fascist,
a populist figure.
Yeah, in many ways, yeah. So that's when it got really intense, and it just kind of snowballed from then onwards.
But how exactly does it snowball from you don't give us ammunition, please give us more ammunition, you suck, to we're going to march into Moscow and try to do God knows what, take you on, negotiate with you. Like, it snowballed really quickly. How exactly did that happen?
The turning point is when Shoigu announced that Wagner fighters and all other fighters of these mercenary groups, these volunteer groups, would all have to sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry.
So dozens of private military companies, on which there are, in fact, dozens in Russia, they all now have to kind of succumb to the orders of Shoigu.
Yeah, it sounds like a kind of universal thing. Wagner wasn't mentioned specifically in the announcement, but it was a very clear, targeted move by Shoigu, by the Russian regular military command. We don't know if Putin was involved in coming up with this or if he was even asked, but they did this, and it was very clear that if this happened, that would be the end for Wagner's independence, for Prigozhin's personal kind of political room for maneuver. And so he initially came out and said, absolutely not, we refuse to do that. On June 23rd, on Friday evening, Prigozhin, having recorded a video earlier where he basically demolished all of Russia's propaganda justification for the war, he claimed that the defense ministry had carried out a missile strike on a Wagner base. We don't know where it was, but people speculate it was in occupied Ukraine. He said that it's time to restore justice. It's time to kind of bring Shoigu and Gerasimov what they deserve. And that evening, off they went, and we all found out in the morning what that would actually look like. And
what did that look like? How did Prigozhin's threats materialize?
I guess the thing we all woke up to on Saturday morning was that Wagner troops were in Rostov. It's this big southern city of about 1 million people in Russia, quite close to the Ukrainian border, and it's a central hub for Russia's operations in the war against Ukraine, especially in eastern Ukraine. It's the headquarters of the Russian Southern Military Command. And so he actually sat down with a deputy defense minister and told him, this is what we're doing. It had a real kind of criminal authoritative vibe to it. And he took Rostov, without any resistance, basically. We saw no evidence of local National Guard or FSB or anyone really do anything about him. We saw, in many ways, similar to the scenes of Russian troops, occupying Ukrainian cities at the very beginning of the war. Wagner troops, tanks in the middle of the city, central streets. There was a T-90 tank that got stuck in a circus gate, which was nice to see. And then by the early hours of the morning, they headed up straight the M4 highway from Rostov towards Moscow. They went through the city of Voronezh pretty quickly. Were
there any casualties or real active fighting between Russian military units and Wagner?
So we didn't see any intense fighting on the ground. Basically, what we did see was fighting in the air. So we have evidence of 6 helicopters in total and 1 kind of command plane that was shot down because the Wagner columns they had these these mobile air defense units with them. The column just kept moving, and it seemed like it was meeting very little resistance most of the way.
What was the people's reaction? Just regular locals who were seeing all of this unfold?
Yeah, that was kind of one of the weirdest things about it. It was that in Rostov, the locals seemed to really, not all of them, some kind of shouted some things, but almost all of them seemed to either welcome the Wagner troops, take photos with them, bring them coffee, or just kind of go about their day. There was this video of the street cleaner just cleaning his street as the tanks were chilling in the main square.
So bizarre.
Yeah.
What were Prigozhin's actual goals here? Did he state any clear demands? And from that, another question is what's the most accurate way to refer to what happened? Was it an attempt of a coup? Was it a rebellion of some sort? Was it, I don't know, a march of justice, as Prigozhin called it? Because so many media outlets refer to this differently. And if you read Twitter, it's a whole another kind of drain of opinions. So what's the actual accurate way to refer to these events?
I remember clearly as we were our group, our editorial team was scrambling to figure out what was going on and how to call it. We were discussing between coup attempt, between mutiny, rebellion. I mean, mutiny sounds like it's on a ship. Rebellion sounds like they're brave freedom fighters, so we didn't really like that either. But then coup attempt gets back to your original question, which is like, what were his goals? And I guess the main thing that a lot of us were trying to figure out at the time was, is he going against Putin himself or not?
Because he hasn't mentioned Putin at all in any of his video messages and audio messages, right?
Yeah, there was one where he said that the president has made a big mistake and we're not going to come and surrender to him. So that was the point where a lot of us were thinking, okay, he's really going for it. I mean, we don't think he's going to succeed, but this seems to be what you could call a coup, because how can you take on Moscow? How can you take on the whole Russian military establishment without taking on Putin, who of course can always jump on a plane, which I think he did, to go to another part of Russia. So it's tricky. I think now, what he was saying, of course, was that it was this march of justice. It was a show of force. He was doing it to save Wagner's honor and, save Wagner as an organization and try and bring down Shoigu and Gerasimov, because that's what he was saying. He was always going after them. I think the truth is somewhere in between. Now I think it's clear that he didn't really believe he could go after Putin himself. And I think what many experts agree on is that he really thought he had a chance. He thought he had allies in the security services. He thought that, being so outward and public, especially if the defense ministry kind of reacted incompetently, which they did as usual, that maybe somehow Putin could flip to his side and be like, okay, we got to go with Prigozhin here. But of course, with hindsight, that also had very, very little chance of success.
Speaking of Putin, what was he doing as all of this was unfolding hour by hour? Was there an immediate reaction of some sort from the Kremlin?
At first, as usual, he was very quiet. We heard nothing from him overnight, and then in the morning we were all at this security training. We were ready to stop everything and watch his address, which turned out to be, dry,
extremely anticlimactic
and boring as usual. But that's okay. Basically, he said he was kind of dramatic in the sense that he said, this is like 1917. This needs to be crushed.
The appeals to history.
Yeah, this is a stab in the back to the motherland.
Can we just point out that literally sounds like Nazi propaganda?
So finally, after everyone woke up and they took Rostov, and Putin finally came out and said something, we saw that they were preparing for this scenario of defending Moscow. National Guard kind of leader, Viktor Zolotov, who's a close ally of Putin, he was kind of making the excuse for not acting anywhere else, saying that his priority was concentrating his forces and defending Moscow, which is an interesting excuse. But that's what it looked like. So we could see that, they were actually tearing up their own roads with these diggers. They were trying to put huge civilian trucks kind of in the way of the Wagner columns, which in one point, Wagner just pushed through them. And they were digging trenches outside Moscow, which is an always exciting picture. But, so it's very difficult, obviously, to actually picture, what it would look like. You had this column of armored vehicles and lots of random pickup trucks and tanks on trucks, heading towards Moscow. And it's very, difficult to imagine what it would look like if they all had to stop and fan out into battle formation and then move forward on this city of 15 million people. It would have been very strange. But they were preparing, they seemed to take it seriously.
Did Prigozhin have any allies? You mentioned that perhaps he was hoping that he's going to get more support than he ultimately did.
Yeah, and this is where it comes back to his kind of ideological image, I guess, of being the true patriot against all the traitors and all the people with their villas overseas. He was really reaching out to everyone, to units of the military, to rank and file soldiers, to the National Guard and so on, to come join us, on our march of justice. But, everyone was scared. People, I think, understood that his chances were very, very little here. They would prefer to just step back and see what happens. Within the Russian military itself, a lot of people have said that Prigozhin's main ally is this guy, Sergei Surovikin, who actually had the role of the head of Russia's kind of war against Ukraine, the leader of all of the joint operations for a few months, including during the time when Russia had to leave Kherson. And he was always seen as a kind of Prigozhin within the ministry, kind of also more rational, more brutal, more ruthless, but kind of more efficient as well. And he was known to get along with Prigozhin. But Surovikin came out very early on, with a gun on his lap, and called for him to stop and called for Wagner to put down their arms. But then just today, there was a report in the New York Times citing US officials, as they always do, saying that Surovikin actually knew about the plans earlier and perhaps was prepared to help Prigozhin, or perhaps Prigozhin expected him to help. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch in the next week or so, like what happens to Shoigu, of course, Gerasimov, but also what happens to Surovikin,
So we know that Moscow obviously didn't fall. Putin is still Russia's dictator. So Prigozhin didn't succeed. He didn't reach Moscow. How did all of that end? Why was that also so anticlimactic?
Yeah, so it ended very, very suddenly. At first, it was Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko who first said that he had a chat with Prigozhin and convinced him to call the whole thing off. And then within a few minutes, we heard on Prigozhin's press service, where he always uploads his voice messages to the world, he also said, we're calling it off. He said, we've reached the point where blood will be spilled, not mentioning the helicopter pilots who were shot down. So we're turning around. We're going back to our field camps in the rear. And that was it. Very quickly, you saw them going back. You saw Prigozhin leaving Rostov with a lot of cheering and happiness.
And what do we know about this deal negotiated by Lukashenko, of all people?
So it's worth, I guess, saying at this point, when we talk about the deals, the backroom dealings, behind the scenes stuff, and what we can expect in the next few days, there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of speculation. But apparently, the official line is that Lukashenko talked to Prigozhin, perhaps on the request of Putin, and basically the deal that was agreed to was that Prigozhin would go into exile into Belarus.
With his Wagner forces, or no?
Well, that's the question about the future of Wagner. Peskov has said that Wagner fighters basically have a choice out of three things, actually. They can either go...
How democratic of them.
Yeah. They've always gotten special treatment. They can either go to Belarus with Prigozhin, stick to their guy, or they can sign contracts with the military, or they can just go home.
Just quit.
Yeah, because they hadn't signed contracts before, so they were doing their own thing. So that seems to be what's going on. There was a bit of to and fro about these criminal charges, because immediately, the FSB brought criminal charges against him, against Prigozhin for, trying to overthrow the state almost. And they were said to be dropped, but then the Russian media reported that they weren't dropped, and then they confirmed that they were definitely dropped.
And is he in Belarus now? Do we know anything about his location?
Lukashenko has reported that he's arrived in Belarus. He's been spotted at a hotel in Minsk, but we don't know much else about that. We don't know much about Wagner movements to Belarus yet, or any other things. And when it comes to his future, we also don't really know any details about his kind of Wagner empire and his Concord business empire. If that is all intact in the end, that will be kind of miraculous for him, considering
what he tried to do.
Yeah, I think Wagner's activities in African countries, in Syria, they'll be preserved. I don't know who will be leading it, and we'll have to wait and see when it comes to his businesses.
It honestly seems like everyone has their own explanation of what actually happened and why it actually happened, because some people, a good number of them actually, don't even believe that this was a genuine attempt at a coup or a rebellion to begin with. They think that this whole situation is kind of Kremlin coordinated theatrics for whatever reason. So since there is no real way of knowing what really happened, let's talk at least about some of these theories and what the experts who've studied Russia for a very long time are saying.
Yeah, so obviously events as crazy as the ones that happened over the weekend have given birth to a kind of a plethora of theories, of speculations back and forth about a deal being done here or there, or this being the real plan, this is all theater, and so on. Some of them include, people were saying that Putin and Prigozhin were working together against Shoigu, and this was going to be a way to remove Shoigu without it coming directly from Putin. Some people, again, said that Putin and Prigozhin were working together, but it was not specifically to remove Shoigu, but it was a test for the rest of the elites.
Right, that's the one I've heard.
The National Guard, the security structures, to see, who would come out
supporting Prigozhin.
Who would come out supporting Putin. Again, I think the fate of Surovikin will be interesting to keep an eye on. But before getting too deep into these theories, some might have really good argumentation behind them, but it's worth thinking about really if it makes any sense in terms of what we actually saw in Russia. For this to be a coordinated action between Putin and Prigozhin, for example, you need to see that this was kind of beneficial for them. You need to see that it makes sense for them to be motivated to do this. And as for Putin, it's deeply embarrassing. It's deeply embarrassing for him, for his rule, for Russia as a whole. And I think before giving any kind of credence to the idea that he was behind this and kind of an organizer of this, you need to really think about these consequences, because this is the opposite of what Putin wants to show that Russia is, to his own people, to the world. He's always been the force of stability, the force of unity, I guess. Experts that I've read and respected and discussed with, they've all been pretty clear that it seems to be a genuine attempt, although maybe not on Putin himself, of course. And that's what Ukraine is also saying.
So now that it's all over, let's talk about some of the consequences that might spill over from this. Most importantly, what does all of this mean for Ukraine, for the war, and also just politics in the country?
That's the most important thing right now. And unfortunately, it seems like probably not very much. We have no evidence of regular Russian military units who are assigned to the front line in occupied Ukraine at all being rediverted, being redirected to deal with this Wagner threat, which was over again within 24 hours. If it had gone on for long, if they'd occupied Rostov, then that would have been a different scenario entirely. So in that sense, the job for Ukraine is still the exact same thing. They have to overcome these defenses. They have to move forward. And Wagner had already left the front line. Wagner, was in these camps. They'd left Bakhmut. So I guess the real thing to discuss is the removal of Wagner as a player, military-wise. Entirely from this war. We don't know exactly what their future is. They might keep the brand and be under the defense ministry, but it won't be the same thing. We know that a lot of them will leave now. They've already said that a lot of their military equipment, the heavy weapons, will be handed over to the National Guard, making the National Guard even stronger at not defending from coups. It won't be the same thing as before. Clearly, we know that the military is doing their own private military company thing. So in the end, that's good news for Ukraine. Prigozhin, having pushed things so far, won't now be able to get more favor, get more resources, maybe start recruiting again and basically rebuild Wagner into a thing that can basically repeat the Battle of Bakhmut somewhere else. We know how costly that was for Ukraine as well. We know the kind of war crimes that were committed in those areas. So that's ultimately good. You could make the counter argument that now the Russian military and security system is more united. That could improve the way they go about things on the battlefield, because we saw that disunity was kind of what resulted in Ukraine actually going on the offensive around Bakhmut.
But I think their disunity is much, much deeper than Wagner versus MOD.
Well, yeah, and it's also like potentially they're more unified, but they're unified in their inefficiency.
Since you said that Prigozhin and Wagner as a whole might end up or already ended up in Belarus, how does that change the game for Lukashenko, if at all? Because I think it was a bit unexpected that he suddenly popped up and got involved, although Turkey did suggest its support as always in mediating the situation.
Yeah, I think the Lukashenko factor is really interesting here. It's worth noting that Prigozhin himself hasn't really talked about Lukashenko much having a big role in this. He didn't announce it when he first announced he was turning back. It was like, oh, I decided not to spill blood. But it's a really interesting one. I mean, he's definitely kind of improved his standing with Putin. People always talk about how much autonomy he has compared to Putin. Russia seems to do whatever they want with their military in Belarusian territory. But, he seems to have more leverage now. Again, what we don't know is what kind of role Wagner will have in Belarus and what kind of position Prigozhin will have. So again, it opens the discussion to a lot of theories. People have been talking about how Prigozhin could be Putin's tool in Belarus, ready to potentially take control there if Lukashenko doesn't do what Putin wants him to do.
What about Russia itself? Because this surely has to have great consequences for Russia domestically and also internationally, regardless of who is really behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth listening to Putin about this himself, in this...
What does he say?
In this kind of tired, angry address on the day of this great march on Moscow, he went for it. He compared this to 1917, to the Russian Revolution, which, for him is this horrible year when the great Russian Empire fell apart, they killed the Tsar, and civil war broke out in Russia. So Putin was referencing this year and using the word civil war. People have made comparisons to the Kornilov coup attempt in 1917, which is between Russia's two revolutions, which again, it was unsuccessful, but it was a sign at the time of how weak the Russian government was at the time, and it was like a prelude, right, to another revolution, and that incited a long and devastating civil war. But yeah, with this language, for him to talk about being stabbed in the back by traitors of the motherland, and then to just let this guy go and live a happy life and maybe take some of his soldiers with him. I mean, we'll see what will happen with that. But again, it's a great sign of weakness for the guy who always, puts on an image of being tough against the enemies of the motherland.
It definitely doesn't match the reputation and image Russia has amongst certain circles in the West, of it being the great Russian Federation that is so strong and almighty that the West shouldn't really try to mess with. But here is how a coup attempt played out. So is Russia really that strong?
And we'll see in the international arena kind of how this affects things. One interesting moment during that crazy day was that Putin called President Tokayev of Kazakhstan, which is obviously, they play a bit of a balancing act. They cultivate relationships with China and the West, but they've always been a strong ally of Russia in the Eurasian Economic Union, in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, through which Moscow actually helped Kazakhstan crush some really violent unrest just a year and a half ago. And he called this guy for help. And Tokayev just said, that's an internal matter of Russia. So when you have the kind of this, one of your strongest allies refusing to give you any help, and the other one is negotiating the peace deal with the guy who's marching on Moscow, you understand. I mean, it gives a pretty good picture. Although I will say, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, we had sanctions, we had crazy tension everywhere. A lot of people started immediately theorizing, right, about some kind of internal palace coup attempt against Putin. Is someone going to knock him off? And then for a while, that seemed to die down. It seemed like, okay, everyone in Russia is playing their part, even if they don't like it. But at the same time, slowly, Putin was kind of breeding this almost perfect coup leader in many ways, in Prigozhin. He thinks for himself. He's charismatic. He's got a big public image, which has its attraction to some people, as opposed to the image of the leader. And he has a private army, which is well trained and well equipped and experienced. If anyone could pull off something like that,
it's Prigozhin.
It's Prigozhin, and you could see how kind of short he fell, like how impossible that task was to take on the whole establishment. So that's the one thing. If we're going to talk real, like Russia the leadership is weaker than ever, but at the same time, we can, I think, leave these conversations about palace coups for a while going forward.
We're now going to be answering some questions that we got from our community members. The Kyiv Independent has finally launched its very own membership system. So it's now really easy to support us and donate to us without any intermediaries. You just have to go to our website at kyivindependent.com/membership. You'll find all the options for donations there. You can also do a one-time donation. And you also get really cool perks like access to exclusive events. Sometimes it's discussions with journalists, sometimes with editors. You also get the chance to send us in questions before every single episode. And you also get access to a really cool Discord server. We have a Discord server with all of the journalists there and the editors and community members. And we try to engage as much as possible and answer your questions there as well. So a lot of questions that we got were about the hypothetical threat of, now that Wagner is in Belarus, maybe they could either independently or after joining forces with the Belarusian army launch another invasion from the north and target Kyiv, for instance. Some media outlets even reported on this. So how real is that, do you think?
To answer quickly, not very real. It's worth remembering that Prigozhin and Wagner moving to Belarus doesn't really change the equation of a potential second invasion from the north in any way. The Russian military always had free access, basically, to the territory of Belarus. They had this disastrous invasion at the start when Ukraine was a lot less well-armed and less prepared. And it failed completely, and they left. And, there hasn't been anything that's changed since then that could make this more possible. You'd have to cross a state border with very well-prepared defensive lines. They could have always moved Wagner to Belarus and tried that anyway. So it definitely wasn't the plan. And again, it's just a fraction of what Wagner is now. And what Wagner is now is just a fraction of what Wagner was 6 months ago, before their losses in the Battle of Bakhmut. And it's going to be Wagner without heavy weapons. So nothing to worry about.
If Prigozhin somehow took control of the entirety of Russian forces, what effect might that have on the war? Because Prigozhin did say that there was no reason for Russia to invade Ukraine. That goes back to what you've mentioned earlier. Before this coup attempt, Prigozhin basically debunked all of Kremlin's official narrative propaganda and said that Ukraine never posed a threat to Russia. But at the same time, Prigozhin is so often described as bloodthirsty, and these are such polar opposites. This is a very interesting question because I think some people might risk seeing Prigozhin as some sort of anti-Putin hero, but maybe it's worth mentioning.
Yeah,
it's
definitely worth mentioning because, even within Ukrainian social media, I don't know if you saw this, but people kind of turned on each other a bit on that day in the sense that a lot of people started posting all these memes, egging Prigozhin on, oh, he's our guy, he's he's a secret agent of Budanov or something
Those
like that.
Those were good memes.
Yeah, they were good memes, but then, other people were like, hang on, you know how many of our people, like our soldiers and civilians, have been killed by this guy? You know how many...
Tortured, raped?
Yeah, but to go back to the question, which is obviously very hypothetical and, you know, but it's interesting, like, what is his ideology? What is his real stance on the war? Because on one hand, he, unlike Putin, he lives in a world of reality, and not a world of mysticism and Russian world and I'm the emperor, you know, bringing back our territories. But then again, he's a warlord as well, you know. It's like, you ask what is...
He makes money off killing people.
Yeah, he makes money off killing people. He makes money off death. And I think most of us would agree that his fundamental ideology is self-interest. But if he was in charge of it all, what he would do, it's hard to imagine a warlord like Prigozhin without war. So without him, I think we're in a good place.
One of the most popular kind of memes and just things that were going around Ukrainian social media is that kind of the most ridiculous and the saddest thing about all of it is that a civil war almost began in Russia over the topic of how to kill Ukrainians most effectively. I thought that was just like a perfect summary of what happened and why Prigozhin is not an anti-Putin hero and why they deserve each other. On that note, Francis, thank you very much for being here. As always, it was very interesting to listen to you.
Always a pleasure.
Also this week, on June 27th, Russian missiles hit a crowded restaurant in the city of Kramatorsk in Donetsk Oblast, killing at least 11 people and injuring more than 30. As Ukraine's counteroffensive gains traction, Ukraine's armed forces reported liberating the village of Rivnopil in Donetsk Oblast, as well as advancing several kilometers in multiple directions of the front line. And the former head of Kherson Oblast Council, Vladislav Manher, was found guilty of the murder of activist Katerina Handyuk, who was attacked with acid and died from chemical burns back in 2018. While Manher was found guilty of ordering the murder, his assistant was convicted of organizing it. Both were sentenced to 10 years in prison, as well as ordered to pay more than $400,000 in compensation to Katerina's family. You can find our show on YouTube and all audio platforms every Friday morning. If you like this episode, please subscribe to us and like our content wherever you're listening to this podcast. Also check out Ukraine's True History, the Kyiv Independent's latest multimedia project that sheds light on Russia's distortions of Ukrainian history and debunks Russian propaganda. Support us by donating to us and becoming a member of our community by going to kyivindependent.com/membership, and support us also on social media by subscribing to our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll be back next week. Thank you for watching.